the stories of werewolves, and if you want to know where I got this shirt, I got it on Amazon. I can send you the link if you want. But werewolves have kind of a long history. So it actually, the idea of the werewolf dates all the way back to Greek mythology, probably a little bit earlier than that. But then the werewolf sort of had this like resurgence during the Middle Ages, and this is sort of the time of like the witch trials. So when you see that, when you read about or hear these stories about these witch trials that took place throughout the Middle Ages and up into like even the 16s and 1700s, right alongside the witch trials were these searches for werewolves. Now, sometimes these werewolves were created because of things that the witches had done, curses that they had put on people. Sometimes it was other reasons that these people became werewolves. And it's really interesting when you look and when you see this history, because, I mean, for a lot of us, like, I don't know. I could be wrong. You know, maybe you're the kind of person, like, you go outside. Like last night, I went outside to put our fire out, and I heard this noise. It was a raccoon, by the way, but I heard this noise, and it like jumped, and like it jumped under the shed, and like I about jumped into the pool at that point. Like I was so afraid of what it was, but I didn't at any point think to myself, what if that was a werewolf? Maybe that would, there was no part of me that said that, right? I thought, well, maybe it was like a person or a kid messing around, or then I realized it was a raccoon, and I still like walked in the house as soon as I could, right? And I was like, do raccoons attack? I don't know. Like, I just want to get inside the house because I don't want to mess with a trash panda. That does not sound like a very good idea. So, but at no point in that thought process was I like, what if it was a werewolf? At no point did I hear a man howling and turning into a werewolf. But if you look back in history, like people actually believed, they were convinced that these werewolves were real. Now, again, maybe we don't believe in the actual validity of werewolves like our ancestors did, but I think that we're still fascinated by this creature. I think we're fascinated because if you look up werewolf t-shirts, there's werewolf t-shirts all over Amazon. And if you look up werewolves, you'll find werewolves from every generation, all different kinds of movies, and everybody probably has their own favorite story of a werewolf. I'm not going to list all of them, but I started thinking about a few of the different werewolves from different generations. So we've got the werewolf Eddie Munster. Maybe anybody has like Eddie Munster. Did you know Eddie Munster was a werewolf? Like Eddie Munster, like that's maybe some people's favorite werewolf. There was Remus from Harry Potter. That's another, oh, see, we get woos. I love the woos in this church. We get the woos for Remus from Harry Potter. We got Jacob from Twilight. Anybody at Twilight? Oh, yeah, see. I wonder why they like Jacob from Twilight. So there's another werewolf, but my all-time favorite has to be Teen Wolf. And I'm not talking, let's have a real, you know what? Let's have a real conversation here. I'm not talking about MTV remake Teen Wolf stuff. Is it MTV? What's Teen Wolf on? Which is it MTV or is it HBO or I don't know what it is. It doesn't matter. I'm talking the real Teen Wolf. I'm talking the 1980s Teen Wolf. And I know and I realize, and this is probably true of everything. Like I look back and I'm like, you know, Jill, we should watch Gremlins with the girls. I watched it when I was their age, and then you watch it and you go, Why was I allowed to watch this? Were my parents okay? You know, like I look back and I see these 80s movies. Like one day, we're really into Star Wars, and I was like, Emily, you know, if you like Star Wars, we should watch Spaceballs together. And then we're watching it, and I was like, I watched this like every day after school when I was like in third grade, which explains a lot. I mean, it explains a lot, doesn't it, Justin? Like, it explains a lot, right? But you watch these movies and you go, why was I allowed to watch this? So Teen Wolf is probably not one that I'll show Emily, but it was probably one of my favorite movies. Now, the jokes went over my head, but I still got the point. The point was this. This kid, Scott, was just a normal teenage kid, right? If there's any such thing as a normal teenage kid. And then he realizes at some point that he's genetically inherited the power and curse of turning into a werewolf. And while he tries to come to terms with it, he soon discovers this thing that we discover about every werewolf story, that he is one way some of the time, but then he's a completely different way some of the other time. So he has this like reality for him that like he can be one kind of person, but then he turns into a completely different person at different times. And here's where this becomes a relationship ghoul that we can talk about for us today, is that we've all known people like this. We all know the werewolves in our lives who act one way in front of some people, but a completely different way in front of somebody else. Does anybody know that people like this? Has anybody ever worked for someone like this? Has anybody ever gone to school with someone like this? I won't ask you if you've ever lived with somebody like this, but like this is a reality, that there are these werewolves in our lives who act one way in front of one group of people and a completely different way in front of a different group of people. Now, just like our other relationship ghouls, we can actually find examples of this in the Bible. We're not going to find werewolves in the Bible necessarily, but we're going to find people who act like werewolves in Scripture, because these relationship ghouls that we're talking about are just as old as humanity itself. And sometimes I wonder, maybe some of these stories that we talk about, I wonder if they even have their origins in people trying to understand why people are the way they are. Like if you took off like all of the stuff, if you began to carve all of it away, maybe psychologically it just sort of helps us to say, you know what, like sure, like that werewolf with all the hair and the teeth and the scariness, like that's the scariest version that I could come up with of someone who acts one way in front of some people and a different way in front of other people. But maybe for some of us, we need that character to help us deal with the reality that that's how people actually act. So maybe behind the layers is this recognition that there truly are these werewolves in the world. Well, what might be surprising to us is that as we look at these werewolves in Scripture, one of the werewolf type people that we find was actually one of the most famous followers of Jesus. We think to ourselves, that just doesn't make sense. How could that possibly be? But then we realize, well, if you've been around church very long, you have probably found some werewolves in the church, so maybe it's always just been that way. This man named Peter, who was a follower of Jesus, was actually even a leader in the early church. And he's a lesson to us, not just in believing in God's grace, but actually living it out, because that's what he wrestled with. His duplicity was this idea that he seemed to want to follow Jesus. He seemed to want to believe in his grace. He seemed to want to extend it to all the people around him. But when push really came to shove with that, he really had a hard time of living it out. Now, the story of Peter the werewolf, as I'm going to call him from now on, begins in a familiar place in the book of Acts. Acts was a book that tells us the story of what happened following the death and resurrection of Jesus. All these followers of Jesus were trying to figure out what I like to say is what just happened, because they knew his life, they knew his teaching, and then they get to this place of his death and his resurrection, and they're all kind of sitting going, well, what does this mean, and what do we do with this, and how do we live this out? And they're really just kind of asking the same questions that we're asking. What does all of this mean, and what do we do with this, and how does it apply to our lives today? So in the book of Acts, we find these people, they're wrestling with this, and we see that the early church kind of struggled with some things, just like we struggle with things today in the church. But the things they struggled with are maybe a little different, or look at it a little different, or have some different definitions. Well, one of the things that they struggled with was, who is this faith for? Like who is Jesus for? What do we do with this Jesus story? What do we do with this good news stuff? And who is it for? Now, I think it's easy for us to say, because we're 2,000 years later, we've kind of worked through some stuff. We still wrestle with this question. But when I say, who is Jesus for? Most of us would respond with, well, everyone, right? I mean, we would at least say it. And I think most churches and most followers of Jesus, if you said, who is Jesus for? The answer, I think most of the time, would be, well, everyone. But the early church wrestled with this because Jesus and his followers come out of Judaism. Jesus was a good Jew, and his followers were Jewish people. And so as he taught, and even as he began to teach in such a way that they could see that what he was teaching was for the whole world, after his death and then his resurrection, as all of these people were now alone to wrestle with this, they looked around and said, well, maybe it was just for us. Maybe this is just for us, and maybe it's not supposed to go to these other people. Back then, the world was split between a couple of different things. You had the Jewish people, and this was one group of people, and everybody else had this definition name of being called Gentiles. And so the early church, while we don't wrestle with this today, that they would sit around and they would be like, well, and they would have huge arguments about it and say, well, this is a Jewish faith, and this is for Jewish people. And then somebody would say, but I think it might be for the Gentile people too. And the Jewish followers would look over and kind of boo them and say, no, it's not for them. What are you talking about? It's just for us. And so this was sort of a conflict that happened in the scriptures. Well, in Acts 10, we find this pivot point. And this story is going to sound familiar, but I want to read it because it helps us get where we're going today. It says this. It says, at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need, and he prayed to God regularly. So like he wants to be in on this thing. Okay, we kind of see from here to the beginning. Well, it goes on. It says, one day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear. What is it, Lord? He asked. The angel answered, your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea. When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, get up, Peter, kill and eat. Surely not, Lord, Peter replied. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean. The voice spoke to him a second time. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped by at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them. Peter went down and said to the men, I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come? The men replied, we have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so he could hear what you have to say. Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The following day, he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up. Stand up, he said. I'm only a man myself. While talking with him, Peter went inside. He found a large gathering of people. He said to them, you are well aware. So now here's our pivot point. You are well aware it is against the law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. Now he's not talking about like Roman law. He's talking about religious law. And religious law, again, nobody's going to get arrested, right? But he's worried what other people might think because this is breaking the religious law. And sometimes I think when we have religious law, we might even take those more serious than state laws, right? So he says it is against the law. He says, I'm not supposed to be here. It's against the law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. Then he goes on, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So on his journey, he thought about the vision he had. And he realized that the vision was telling him that this was enough. That the walls that people had made, that the barriers that people had put up, that the laws that had been put in place to keep these people apart, for a better word, just made no sense. And he said, so God has told me, I want you to imagine this, listen to this. I want you to think about what Peter is saying here before we read on. That he is literally looking at these people and going, God has told me to tear down those walls. Now again, really? So you're going to go up against all these religious people and this terrible T word called tradition, and you're just gonna say, oh, all that doesn't matter anymore, and everything's going to be fine? That's what you're going to do? I mean, Peter's pretty bold here, and he's like, no, God told me. Be really careful. I don't think we should be going around going, well, God told me. But here he's like, God told me. And I think this is one of those places where, it's really interesting. When somebody says something like, well, God told me that the world is going to end at the end of the year, I think we can be a little suspicious if that might be true. We might want to have some discernment and think about that and pray on that if that's something we should listen to. Or if somebody says, well, God told me that if you would give $1,000, he will return 10,000 to you, right? Like those people like that teach like that maybe we should have a little discernment and question the motives and if that seems right. But there's something about this God told me that's a little bit different. When somebody says, but God told me that the goodness and grace of God is wider than I thought, there's not a time in my life that has ever been wrong. Because the story of Scriptures, especially the story in Acts, is about a widening of God's grace, mercy, and love to this whole world. The stories are all about sharing his goodness and grace and mercy with the world. So this is a place where we can say, what did God say? We can go, yeah, this tracks. This fits with what God has seemingly been doing in these stories. So he goes on, but God has shown me I should not call anyone impure or clean. So when I was sent for you, I came without raising any objection, because clearly this made sense. He then says, may I ask why you sent for me? Well, Cornelius answered, 3 days ago I was in my house praying at this hour at 3 p.m. Suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayer and remembered your gifts to the poor. Send to Joppa for Simon, who is called Peter. He is a guest in the home of Simon the tanner who lives by the sea. So I sent for you immediately, and it was good of you to come. Now, we are all here in the presence of God to listen to everything that God has commanded you to tell us. And I just love this, because I love that Peter sort of walks in and he goes, I don't know what's going to happen. I just know that I feel that God has sent me to this place. So why did you ask for me? And then it's sort of like Cornelius walks back, gets on a karaoke machine, gets on the microphone, and he goes, well, ladies and gentlemen, what I did was I asked Peter to come here today because he's going to speak to us. Peter kind of looks and he's like, what now? And he just kind of turns the spotlight on him and he goes, all right, Peter, the floor is yours. It's good of you to come. So we're all waiting. Just tell us what to say. And then Peter says this statement, and this is the pivot point. This is literally he's like setting the TNT against the wall. Then Peter began to speak. I now realize, so again, we've talked about this. He changed his mind. I realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism. but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. Now, he had all kinds of people with him. So he didn't have just Cornelius and his Gentile friends that he shouldn't be hanging out with. He also had some Jewish friends who came along with him. And I just love this moment because it's sort of like Peter sets the TNT charges against the wall of exclusion, and then he sort of like pulls the rope over, and he's got like the little plunger, that they used to have. It says Acme on the front of it. They had in the cartoons. And they're like, what do you think? And he's like, well, I changed my mind. And I now realize, hold on a second, God does not show favoritism. Right? That thing explodes. All the people who are with him look at him, and they're just like, what just happened? He just completely opened up the door for God's grace and mercy. Now, I told you this story might sound familiar because we just read it as a part of a series called The Great Emergence. And during that series, we learned that Peter's vision helped him to see that these food laws that prohibited him from eating with Gentiles had actually caused people who believed in those laws to withhold grace from them as well. And so through this vision, Peter's mind is changed into such a place that explosion is the only thing I can think of that makes any sense. That his brain just, what he could possibly imagine about God's grace just is an explosion in his mind. He realizes that God's love, God's grace, God's church was for everyone. But here's the saddest part of this story. Unfortunately, we realize and we discover that Peter gave in to pressure. And maybe from these people who had come to the house with him, maybe it's some other people later on. But this Peter who says, I have now changed my mind. I don't see that God has any favoritism, that God's grace and love is for everybody. Under peer pressure, this guy who seems to love God's grace becomes convinced maybe he was wrong. And his view of grace actually narrowed back to where it had been. Now, we find this story in a letter written to all of the churches that has started in a region called Galatia. In the opening paragraphs of this letter called Galatians, Paul, the writer, brought up a concern that he had for these churches that were in this region. He was aware that some people had showed up and they were forcing their beliefs on everyone, and they had begun excluding people. Now, these people were sort of out of this group of Jews who looked at these Gentile believers and said, yeah, this might be for you, but to get in, you have to follow all the rules that we think you have to follow so that you can be a part of this thing. And we're still going to treat you like second-class citizens after all of that is over. So it's almost like they say, well, we had to go through all this stuff, so you're going to go through all of this stuff. We're going to haze you into this now as well. And then after all of that is done, we're still not going to eat with you. We're still not really going to be your friends. We're still not going to let you serve or be in the church in the way that you thought you could be in the church. We're just going to kind of keep you off to the side. So you can imagine Paul is like, well, wait a minute. That is not the good news of Jesus that I was telling you about. Now, Paul is fascinating. Paul was Jewish. Paul had this connection, this experience with Jesus where his mind was changed. Paul becomes a guy who's convinced that it's his responsibility to go and share the good news with all of these Gentiles. And in his teaching, he says, no, there aren't any extra rules. There's nothing else you have to do. It's all about faith in Jesus. You belong just like everyone else. Paul didn't have a wall to break down because he had already broken it down, and he was already 100 feet on the other side. And then he finds out, after all this work, imagine all this work he had done. All of this work he had done, all of a sudden, people start showing up and going, well, he's actually wrong. No, you have to do all this other stuff. God's grace isn't as big as Paul thought. So this gets really amazing. Rather than, and here's kind of the pivot that I want us to hear here. Rather than unity built around the table of Jesus, what these people were focused on was uniformity and conformity. So rather than a unity built on the idea that, hey, these are all different people coming to God's grace, no, they were like, no, we all have to look the same and think the same and be the same to be in this place together. To Paul, this kind of thinking was not what Jesus was about at all. Now, here's where this gets really personal. Sadly, Peter went to Galatia, and he went to a city called Antioch. And there, it appears that he abandoned what he had believed about God's grace. Listen to this. In Galatians 2, Paul tells us the story. He says, when Cephas, which was another name for Peter, when Peter came to Antioch, and listen, I love this. He's writing a letter and telling the people about this fight that he had. He's like, I want you guys to hear that I so much believe in this that I looked at Peter and was like, you want some of this? Let's do this, because at the end of the day, this is about God's grace. Like, he is, like, he's writing this letter and sending this out, and I just love Paul's boldness here. Because you know somebody's going to go, did you know Paul wrote a letter about you? And I imagine Paul's going to be like, yeah, let's go. That's what I did. Because I needed to. And listen what he said. He said, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Now let's have some translation here. I want you to imagine the scene being described. Peter was hanging out in the church in Antioch, and he is talking, laughing, drinking, eating with the Gentiles. They are having just a fantastic time. And you can hear Peter's loud voice, because I'm sure he was loud. And he's, cracking it up, and he's patting the Gentiles on the back. And all of a sudden, the door opens. And he sees his Jewish friends walk in, and they begin to walk in. And he knows they're part of this circumcision group, which is the group that said, hey, you have to do all the things we do, right? And you shouldn't be eating together and all this. He sees their shadows, and Peter jumps up so fast. He's literally like spilling drinks. Plates are falling. His chair falls backwards because he's trying to get up as quick as he possibly can because he does not want to get caught hanging out with the Gentiles. So can you imagine the scene? Can you imagine him hopping up and then he goes and sits in his chair and he's just like, what are you talking about? I didn't see anything. He probably used that classic line, it's not what it looks like. Like, what does it look like? There's only one thing it looked like was like you were eating with the Gentiles. And he's apparently so afraid of these guys that he's willing to hop up from his seat. And then here's where Paul really gets ticked off. He's like, he did this in such a way that even his friend Barnabas, another one of Paul's friends, jumps up and gets in on this and backs away and switches seats. So Paul looked on this hypocrisy with absolute disgust, and he couldn't stay quiet any longer. So he goes on, he says, when I saw they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, which is God's good grace for everyone, I said to Peter in front of them all, I just love how he's telling the story. I said in front of all of them, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? He goes, look, when nobody's looking, you're patting backs and palling around with these guys, and you love them the way you're supposed to love them, but when push comes to shove, you treat them like crap and act like they don't belong. So Paul saw the sad truth that Peter was a werewolf. In front of some people, he acted one way, celebrating God's grace and truth, but in front of others, he acted completely different, drawing lines and building walls. And Paul called him out on this because this hypocrisy was wrong. Now, there's a good part of the story. Later on, we discovered that Paul's harsh rebuke worked. In letters that he later wrote, Peter actually talked about how it is God's Spirit in us, not arbitrary rules, that lead us to become more like Jesus. It's a huge shift. It's like he returns back to what he knew was right. He comes back to being the Peter who's putting that TNT against those walls and smashing it wide open. He says, no, this is about God's grace. This is about God's Spirit. This is about everyone. This isn't about all these laws that all of these other people taught. He even wrote about Paul. This is so cool. He even wrote about Paul, and he said, in the letters, he actually said things. He said that you should go read the letters that Paul wrote. He was telling people. He said they're full of wisdom, and they're even worth reading. And side note, one of my favorite things he said, he actually says this, and you can look this up in 1st and 2nd Peter. He actually says, even though they're hard to understand. Like, which feels like a little bit of a dig, and I'm serious, it's actually in there. He actually says, even though they're a little hard to understand, he's like, you should still read Paul. Which shows me like they reconciled. And like they had this connection, and this rebuke made a difference, because why wouldn't it? Peter learned and realized the goodness of God's love and grace. So what we see is that Peter was no longer a werewolf. But here's the big deal of this. Even though Peter might not still be a werewolf, you and I could still be one. The danger is we can all be guilty of doing the exact same thing as Peter. See, because one of the things that we love to say around this church, and you've probably said it with me, and you've probably said it with gusto and excitement and joy, is this phrase: the good news of Jesus is good news for everyone because it's good news for anyone. You've heard me say that, and you've heard me say that we say that all the time. It's good news for everyone because it's good news for anyone, but our understanding of grace like that is easy to hold until it's actually challenged. And we're faced with the moment to stand up for what we say that we actually believe in. So here's some questions that I wanted to put at the end of this for us to think about. What will you do when someone attempts to build walls around God's grace and begins to exclude others? What will you do in that moment when you're with other people who start to say that, hey, you know what? I don't think God's grace is as big as other people think. Will you just sit back and watch? Maybe you'll reluctantly but hypocritically stack some bricks with them to keep that friendship, even though you know that is absolute hypocrisy. And here's another question: or will you stand in their way? Will you even take a sledgehammer or some TNT to the wall that they've been building? Because the truth of the good news of Jesus is worth it to say it and to break some walls. Now, here's another point. You're going to be challenged someday when someone walks through this door, and they might even challenge your view of God's grace. What will you do then? How will you respond? Will the view of grace you've so eagerly pledged become empty words? Or will you actually live out that grace? Reach your hands out to that person. Welcome them in with the open arms of Jesus and welcome them to sit beside you. Because that's the kind of community that we're called to be. And I don't know who that other is in your life. Like, I know who that other would be in my life. That I love to say, oh, the good news is for everyone because it's good news for anyone. And then it's so easy to go, but I'm not sure about that anyone. And that's where the hypocrisy, that's where the werewolf shows up. Because if it's true, and it's true. And there's no sitting back. There's no pulling back from that. There's no werewolf in us when we take serious the love and mercy and grace of God. So let's pray. God, we thank you for this story. In this story that we are reminded how easy it is for someone like Peter, someone who we see who wrote letters and who taught and who was a professional for Jesus, yet even failed to really uphold the grace and the love that you've taught us. Father, rather than pointing fingers today, let us just learn from that story. Let us see in our own hearts, in the places where we are capable of being werewolves and hypocrites and not extending God's grace fully the way that it should be extended. When we say anyone, help us to truly mean anyone. Help us to, even in those days that we're afraid that it's not inclusive of us, to see that we even belong. God, because your mercy and your grace and your love is more expansive than we will ever know. You draw all of us to you and seek to renew all of our hearts and our minds to grow and be like Jesus. It's your name we pray. Amen.